Ladies and gentlemen, we do have a little bit of an ominous update here in regards to the Russia-Ukraine situation, with Marco Rubio recently making statements saying that they might just pull out of the peace negotiations because of the current situation with the Russians not cooperating, blaming the Ukrainians for not properly adhering to the ceasefire that was on infrastructure. And so now Rubio is saying, well, it's probably more so a stipulation to try and kickstart some potential new talks. They've been having talks, I believe, these past few weeks in Paris. Those are going to continue in terms of trying to come to a ceasefire agreement. Now, I'm going to lay down the timeline. Russia recently has been taking Ukrainian territory. Ukraine had a little sliver of Russian territory in the north. They've since lost pretty much all of that. And at this point, Ukraine, last time I checked earlier this morning, had about 19% total land control Russia had 19% total control of Ukraine in terms of the land they're getting from Ukraine, 19%. Whether or not it'll stay that in negotiations, we don't know. And when it comes to Russia, they've been moving very slowly on this war recently. It's kind of come to a grinding halt. But if it is just Russia versus Ukraine, we do have to say Russia will win. If there is no NATO intervention, which there's not going to be, because if it would have happened already under Biden, unless Europe goes crazy and says, well, if Russia mounts a major offensive, which we also don't think is going to happen, then there might be EU involvement, sans the United States, not involving the United States. Now, I do want to say to everyone, as we enter this video, please like it down below. Make sure you subscribe, everything like that. But let's get into this. So Rubio says, U.S. to decide in days if an end of the war in Ukraine is even doable. Quote, if it is not possible to end the war in Ukraine, we need to move on. We need to move on. What does that mean exactly? By the way, we also got big news on a minerals deal. Trump yesterday broke the news and said, we're agreeing to the minerals deal with Ukraine. That's happening next Thursday. Kind of a random, but like yesterday he said, it's happening in a week. So yesterday was Thursday, so it's happening next Thursday. There's going to be a minerals deal with Ukraine. And you're talking about rare earth extraction. Now, we know the most important part of that is refining the rare earths. Maybe we refine them in Ukraine. I don't know. But the point of it is we should be getting our money back, proverbial money back. It's a little bit more complicated than that when it comes to mining in the region and having ourselves tethered to the region. But I do want to say, when it came to the initial rare earth deal that got leaked, that was going to be signed, that was when Zelensky came to the White House, there was no security assurances from the United States. It was just, we were tied to the region. And then Ukraine said, no, we don't want to do this because they're trying to join the EU right now. And they were concerned that if we controlled a lot of their oil and their resources, it would affect their membership application in terms of their sovereignty. And so they applied for it back in 2022. 2023, they were elevated to candidate status. So we'll see what happens in terms of them joining the EU. Maybe that's part of these negotiations. I would imagine it probably is, because they're not going to join NATO. The NATO head has said it's not happening. It's not going to be coming anytime soon. Whether or not there's an agreement to say, okay, they're not allowed to join NATO over the next 20 years, we're not sure on that. But you can see it says the United States will abandon efforts to end the war in Ukraine if it proves impossible to broker meaningful progress in the next several days, according to the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as he departed Paris on Friday after meeting with Macron. Quote, if it is not possible to end the war in Ukraine, we need to move on in a matter of days. And then he talked about that the administration would decide in a matter of days whether or not it is doable in the next few weeks. It later says it is not entirely clear from Mr. Rubio's remarks whether he meant that the United States would merely abandon its efforts to reach a 30-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, President Trump's immediate focus, or abandon Washington's commitments to Ukraine altogether. And so I would imagine this is probably another negotiating tactic to try and put pressure on both Russia and Ukraine to reach a ceasefire agreement, because this is something that's been simmering for the past month and a half. We remember the minerals deal that was supposed to kickstart everything. We'll see if it actually happens. You can see the current map, very, very similar of what we've seen really the past 2 years when it comes to the front line. A lot of this front line is slowly moving to the west. Russia has captured, I believe, over 100 square miles in Ukrainian land over the past few months. And so a lot of this, the front line is obviously limited Russian control. And this would all have to be worked out in terms of, do they get more to the west? Or is there maybe something that gets worked out to where there's a demilitarized zone within this region? So we'll have to see. Obviously, they do want Crimea, the peninsula, connected to Russia. And certainly Zelensky has come out and said, well, we want Crimea back. We want all of our land back. It's simply impossible. It cannot happen unless there's an escalation, which is also very unlikely to happen at this point, unless Russia escalates to a full-fledged, full invasion and really mounts a huge offensive to try and capture all of Ukraine. At that point, that's where I think the European NATO countries untether themselves from the United States and say, no, we're getting involved now. This is just my speculation. I don't know for sure. But if it stays where it is right now, maybe Russia gains a few miles here and there to get better leverage in terms of negotiations. It does seem like Russia is playing coy when it comes to them delaying this ceasefire. Ukraine, they were the ones that originally agreed to the ceasefire. Putin has stalled it since. That's just what's happened. Ukraine agreed to it. Trump went to Russia and Putin. They had a conversation. Putin said, I want to do a ceasefire, but he wanted to have the conversation with Trump. Then it wasn't a full ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire to work out a peace deal. It was a partial ceasefire. And now it's like, no, we can't do a ceasefire because the ceasefire that we originally agreed upon, which was an infrastructure ceasefire and an energy ceasefire, was void because of, I guess, Ukrainians attacking those areas, the infrastructure, Russian infrastructure. That's kind of what's been happening here. So it's a blaming match. They blame each other. Recently, Zelensky was on 60 Minutes. Really, the propaganda is not working. People were telling me about that. It probably lasted like a day. I don't think really any Americans even knew it happened, but he was on 60 Minutes. And it was, again, the propaganda. And he wanted Trump to visit Ukraine. It's like, what are we doing here? It seems like a waste of time. Just, there's really no reason for it to happen. And then also, you did have Zelensky try and buy Patriot missiles, is what it's called. It's like missile defense systems from the United States. He said he wanted them, $15 billion worth. He said he was ready to buy them. And then Trump said, this was a few days ago, he blamed Ukraine for starting the war. He said, if you're going to start a war, you got to know you can win it. You can't start a war against a country that's a lot more powerful than you. Then Trump was asked about that yesterday during his meeting with the Italian prime minister, and he said, well, I didn't mean that. He clarified and said Russia started the war. He's not blaming Ukraine for the war. But, I mean, based on the previous history and what Zelensky has said and the fighting in the Donbass region, obviously the 2014 Ukrainian revolution, we understand that it's a little more complicated than Russia just invading Ukraine. But the point of it is, in 2022, that was an invasion by the Russians. But the reality is, when it comes to a peace agreement, it does seem like Trump, the administration, Rubio, they're getting tired of the Russians, whether it is the Russians or the Ukrainians, both of them dragging their feet when it comes to these negotiations. Now you've got Zelensky saying he wants to buy more missiles from the United States. This is not a very positive development when it comes to where we're at in terms of a ceasefire. And obviously, Trump has said he's going to end the war. I always said, well, he was exaggerating. It's a hyperbole. It's just putting an emphasis on it. People are like, well, Trump said he would end it in 24 hours. Well, we know it's not that simple, but the point is, at least we've got dialogue and negotiation now with Trump, and we did have a partial ceasefire agreed by both Ukraine and Russia. Now that hasn't gone anywhere. That's because this is a messy situation, and obviously the Ukrainians and the Russians both want to be in best position when it comes to peace negotiations. Ukrainians, they're going to want significant military securities, and the Russians are going to want some of the land, a lot of it annexed, along with Ukraine's army possibly demilitarized, and then also maybe new elections in Ukraine, and then maybe someone more pro-Russian comes in rather than pro-Western, or maybe something happens within Ukraine to where it gets split up and there's more land that's taken by Russia. That might be really what Putin wants, and so maybe that's why he's trying to position himself in a better position when it comes to being able to broker for more land within central Ukraine. We really don't know what's going to happen in terms of that. I've heard some different rumors about how much land they're going to be getting. Right now, they do control about 20%. Again, the total number is like 19% total land area of Ukraine in terms of they have control or they've occupied. And so we'll have to see in terms of if there is a peace deal, what ends up happening with that. But you can see Rubio talking about possibly moving on. Rubio threatens to walk away from peace talks. And U.S. offers to ease sanctions on Russia in Ukraine peace proposal. Rubio says it's just a lot of talk. Americans are split on whether Russia is an enemy. Kremlin responds to U.S. threat to abandon peace talks. Right, and so they're definitely trying to move the situation along because it seems like we've hit a roadblock when it comes to these talks. And so maybe that minerals deal with Ukraine on next Thursday will really kickstart some type of peace negotiation or the ceasefire negotiations again. But right now it does seem like there is a little bit of a barrier, even though they are having talks, I believe in Paris, that's where Rubio was, for some type of peace. But with Rubio leaving those talks saying we're going to move on, there's not a lot of optimism in terms of what he was hearing, I'm guessing. And so, or maybe it's just a little nudge to say, all right, let's go. We're done with this. We're not going to continue to do this for another 4 or 5 months. Let's get something worked out here to where we can get a ceasefire and then see where we're at in terms of peace negotiations. What Putin said was he wanted to make sure when the ceasefire happened that he would be in agreement to some type of negotiations, because if you do a ceasefire and then you're way off on peace negotiations, there's no point. The ceasefire will expire and they'll be fighting again. So, or the ceasefire will just be broken and then both sides will blame each other, just like what's happened here. So we'll have to see, but the point of it is this is a very complicated thing. Seems like Russia possibly wants more land. They've certainly spent a lot of time and energy in eastern Ukraine. There's been a lot of fighting in the Donbass region that's been going on for many, many years, not just the past 3, but this war now has gone on for over 3 years, the actual full-scale invasion of eastern Ukraine. And so when it comes to the minerals deal, that'll be another thing we'll have to see. The United States, what is it, 170, 180 billion? I've heard different numbers. I've heard Trump say 360. I've heard some liberals and some people within Ukraine say, oh no, it's only 120 billion, but I believe it's around 170, 180 billion dollars is what we've given them. So we should have access to a significant amount of minerals and rare earths within Ukraine. And again, a lot of the being able to acquire those is to be able to refine them, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's acquiring Greenland, or what are you going to do? Ship them to China? That's what we've been doing, and that's what we can't do because we know the reliance on China is a fickle thing that is not sustainable long term, and it's not healthy long term either. And so we'll have to see. But listen, getting more rare earths, we won't argue about that as long as we can do it in a way that doesn't put us in jeopardy of another conflict within Ukraine. Because we know if there's an agreement and Russia gets 20%, 30% of the territory within Ukraine, they're going to want either a puppet government within the rest of Ukraine, or there might be a reinvasion or 2 or 3. We just don't know. It's an unstable situation. That's why we're calling for a DMZ. And if there is a DMZ, it should be patrolled by the EU. And especially if Ukraine gets put into the EU, that'll be a hostile situation with Russia and Ukraine bordering each other and Ukraine being part of the EU. But listen, that's a European issue. That's a European conflict. So right now, we know that Trump has said that this will happen. There will be a peace deal. I do think there will be a peace deal, but it just comes down to these countries working with each other. And from what I have seen, Russia has blamed Ukraine for violating the initial ceasefire, but it does feel like Russia is kind of dragging their feet in terms of agreeing to a ceasefire, because Ukraine initially agreed to one, and then Russia said, we'll agree to it. Putin said, if I talk to Trump, he talked to Trump, and then there wasn't an actual ceasefire, it was only a partial, and then they said, well, Ukraine violated it, and now Ukraine's trying to buy all these missile systems, and the administration, the Trump administration, I think is getting very frustrated. And so Rubio says something like this, makes a threat about moving on, which seems counter to what Trump has preached leading into the election and after he got elected. It seems like this is a lot of they're not actually going to move on, but they're saying that publicly to try and get the ball rolling in terms of both of these countries coming to the table on some type of peace deal. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.